Hello everybody, this is Slimy and welcome to my episode 7 recap and review of Westworld, Trompe, which is a French term which has two different meanings, both of which are important in this episode. The first being a painting of a photographically realistic object, or two, something that is misleading or deceiving. So this episode contains a major spoiler and plot reveal, so if you have not seen the episode yet, I would definitely suggest putting this video on pause, going back and watching the episode, and then coming back and checking out this video. So let's just jump right into at least the real quick review part of this. This was an amazing episode. There was some fantastic acting both by Tandy Newton and Anthony Hopkins. Let's just give Hopkins the Emmy right now because this is hands down some of the best acting he's done in anywhere between 15 and 20 years. There's an amazing reveal in this episode. Definitely a lot more answers than we've gotten in any of the previous episodes. And it was a nice change of pace where there was definitely a bigger balance of answers than there were new questions. It definitely seems as we're coming closer to the season finale, which is 3 episodes away, that we're finally actually getting to a point where we're going to start wrapping up a couple of these story arcs before we're left with inevitably a few cliffhangers before we go into the next season. Alright, so let's start off with how this episode opens. It opens with a flashback of Bernard in the hospital with his son. His son calls out to him. It seems Bernard is nodded off. They're in the hospital. Bernard's son, who we find out is named Charlie, is sick. Bernard is reading him a story, which is Alice and Wonderland, the very same book he gave to Dolores in an earlier episode. While reading to him in the book, his son interrupts him and says that he needs to tell his father something, but before he can, all of a sudden, all the machines start beeping. Bernard starts to panic, and suddenly he wakes up. The hosts don't have dreams, they just have the notion of nightmares. So then the next scene we have Bernard interviewing Hector, doing a bit of a diagnostic breakdown with Hector after a recent interaction Hector had with a guest, where the guest used a couple of flag terms mentioning that he wanted to take a piece of Hector and mount it on his car. Now, obviously, cars don't exist at this point in time. We're in like the 1880s in the Westworld universe. So Bernard is kind of just doing a bit of diagnostics to make sure that there's nothing wrong with Hector, and Hector seems to be checking out okay. But just to be on the safe side, Bernard shows him a series of pictures of modern cities, trains, and all kinds of things, to which Hector just kind of looks at it blankly and says, "They don't look like anything to me." Now this line is important because this is actually the same exact line Dolores says to the original Peter Abernathy when Abernathy shows her that picture of the girl at Times Square, and Dolores doesn't see anything because she's not programmed to see anything. And she says, "It doesn't look like anything to me." So it's important to note that the hosts are programmed to not notice those kinds of things. If it's not something that should cause them to question their reality, they don't say it. If they're not programmed to say it, they won't say it. Now the next scene that plays out, we're on the train with William, Dolores, and Lawrence. William and Lawrence are playing cards. William beats Lawrence, asks Dolores if she wants to take a hand, to which Lawrence essentially says she doesn't really want anything to do with me, and who could blame her? I totally screwed you guys over, and to be perfectly honest, if I was in that same position, I'm the kind of guy who would do it again. And you gotta love Lawrence for being completely honest like that. The guy is definitely just kind of out for himself. So then Teresa goes upstairs to visit Hale after having been paged. Hale is fooling around with Hector. She puts Hector in freeze mode, sits Teresa down. They have an interview where Hale essentially flexes her muscles as the executive director of the board. She mentions that the board really wants to do away with Ford, and that they kind of want Teresa to essentially succeed Ford. Hale admits to not really liking Teresa personally, but admitting that she's the one, I guess, either qualified for the job or who the board likes the most to take the job. Hale reveals that the people who work there mean nothing, that the code is the most important thing, as well as the little research project that Delos is conducting. That sounds a lot like what Lee Sizemore was hinting at in, I believe it was episode 2, when he was talking with Teresa, in mentioning the whole thing about knowing that this was more than just fulfilling people's deluded fantasies, that there was a lot more going on there than just what was on the surface. But when he couldn't come up with what that was, Teresa pretty much just said, "You're worth absolutely nothing to me, so be careful about where you go digging your nose." Now, the whole reason that they're using Teresa to smuggle this information out of the park is because Ford has done absolutely everything in his power and has done it successfully to keep every aspect of the IP, everything from the manufacturing process to the code itself of the hosts, completely secret. Without him, nothing would be possible. So the board is kind of forced to deal with Ford, whether they like it or not. Hale then mentions that, despite everything that's happened and despite the fact that they're going to kind of right this ship, that because things have kind of been rocky, the gods will require a blood sacrifice. And by that they mean that someone has to get fired over this. And in order for that to happen, they're going to have to do a bit of a demonstration. Our next scene is Maeve waking up. She's obviously a little bit more aware of what's going on. She starts out her morning routine somewhat normally. She arrives at the Mariposa, but instead of listening to that, at this point, very repetitive song, she just slams the piano down. She goes over to the bar. Clementine shows up, and as their scripted dialogue starts to play out, Maeve starts to realize that the words coming out of her mouth are all of those words that she was like seeing on that screen, and she starts to realize, oh my god, this is all not free will, really, is it? Time freezes. Maeve starts looking around. She recognizes that time's frozen, but she hasn't frozen. She sees the dudes in the suit show up, and she thinks they're about to come for her. She grabs a knife off the table. She's about ready to attack, and then they take Clementine instead. The next scene, we're back with William and Dolores on the train. The two of them are having a conversation. William asks about the place that Dolores is looking for and what makes her so sure that it exists. She says she's not, but she's starting to feel like the world she's living in is a lie and that she has no interest in going back. And then suddenly she asks, what is it that you're looking for? You could have done all these other things, and yet you're still here with me. William answers by saying that he grew up loving books and he used to go to bed every night hoping that, he would wake up inside one of those fantastic stories, and that being here in Westworld is like being in one of those stories. To which Dolores responds that she doesn't want to be in a story. She wants to be in the here and now and just to be in the moment. To which William finally breaks and he's like, look, in the real world, I have this woman that I'm supposed to marry, and she's like, oh, Logan's sister, and you can tell she's emotional about it. She gets up, she leaves. William goes and comforts her, and he suddenly comes to realize that this is what he wants. And he says, I've been pretending my whole life. My life's been built on it. it's everything I've ever wanted because I've done all this pretending. And then I came here, I got a glimpse for a second of a life where I don't have to pretend. A life where I can truly be alive. How can I go back to pretending when I know what this feels like? Insert love scene here. William wakes up, he sees Dolores has been drawing this sketch on this piece of cloth canvas of this canyon that meets the water, and she's like, if you had any regrets about last night, he gives her this kiss. He doesn't have any regrets. He feels like the real world and his engagement is just worlds and worlds away. And then he says that he's come to understand the fact that this park is more about revealing your deepest self and getting to know who you really are. He says that Dolores was the key to unlocking that inside of him, to which Dolores responds, "I'm not a key, William." And I think that's really interesting because I think that's exactly what Dolores is. I don't know that she's like William's key per se, but Dolores is definitely a key to this big puzzle. I think she's a key to the maze. She is a key though, and she just doesn't realize it, but she's definitely a key. Suddenly, the train stops abruptly, and there's a bunch of boulders in the tracks, and it's revealed that the Confederados have set up a trap to try to capture Lawrence and the rest of their little gang there. In an amazing move, Lawrence sends out a man on a horse with a white flag to surrender. The man on the horse is revealed to be Slim. Lawrence shoots him, he blows up, he takes a whole bunch of the Confederados with him, and then we get a classic scene straight out of a Western. There's a great horse chase while the gang escapes on horseback, while the Confederados chase after them. Plenty of gunfire exchange. Dolores and William both get some great kill shots, and at one point Dolores falls off her horse. William comes back, saves her. And right as things start looking a little bit hopeless for the gang, the Ghost Nation shows up and proceeds to slaughter all the Confederados. So war breaks out between those two, and Lawrence and company manage to slip away unnoticed. Lawrence ultimately reveals to both of them that once the Ghost Nation finishes getting acquainted with the Confederados, that they will come looking for them next, and that he still has 2 more bodies loaded with nitro that he plans on using as explosives for the war effort, and asks if the 2 of them would like to keep riding on with them. Dolores declines. William also declines. He asks what lays ahead, across that river to the west, and Lawrence tells him that you'd have to ask the dust because no one has ever returned before. So clearly they are making their way to the far reaches of the park at this point. After we last left off Hale, she was talking with Teresa about essentially planning a coup to take over the company. They arranged to have a demonstration to which all of the, big players are present for. Ford is there, Bernard shows up, Stubbs and his team is there, Teresa's there, and Hale is there. They have some concerns over issues with the reveries. They have Clementine there. They wake Clementine up. They send one of the techs in from Stubbs' team to, do some tests to show that these reveries are dangerous. They wake Clementine up. She approaches the tech. The tech beats her stupid. And as things start getting nasty, Stubbs issues a freeze command, and both Clementine and the tech freeze up. It is then revealed that the tech was actually a host programmed to think it was human. So they reset Clementine, they sit her back down, and then they wake her back up and they play the whole scene again. But her reveries cause her to remember how the prior scene had just unfolded, and she viciously counterattacks the tech until she murders him. Stubbs then enters the room. He issues a couple of freeze commands to which Clementine is completely unresponsive to. She turns to confront Stubbs, and as she starts to advance on him, He pulls the trigger and kills her. Hale reveals that, these reveries and the potential for this malfunction to occur is extremely dangerous, and that heads have to roll for this. And that these hosts now all have to be rebuilt from the ground up within a 6-month time frame. When Bernard questions all of that, Hale responds, well, it's really none of your concern because your ass is fired. So next we're back down into the body shop. We see Maeve back down there with Felix and another tech other than Sylvester. She wakes up. Felix is like, look, you gotta stop doing this or someone's gonna notice. You've only been topside for less than a day and you're already back down here. She wants to know where Clementine is. They find out she's down in the body shop. They go, and Sylvester and Teresa are both in a room while Clementine is having a drill shoved up her nose. Suddenly Bernard pops in. He wants to pull Teresa out and have a talk with her real quick. He pretty much tells Teresa that he knows that entire demonstration was a complete sham, but that there was some merit to the fact that the reveries are causing problems, and that the whole notion behind it is that the host's desire to break free from their loops and their patterns and everything, it stems from repetition. It stems from them tapping into their memories. So at some point long ago, they must have broken free once before, or else the idea to deviate from their paths would never even be in their consciousness. Because let's face it, up until the reveries were introduced, they had no issues with any of the hosts wanting to deviate from their loops. But the second the hosts are actually able to tap into old memories, then it becomes a problem. And I think that's interesting, because that means at some point long ago, it was a problem. He then tells Teresa that there's something really important that he needs to show her. They hop into an elevator and take that elevator up to Sector 17. Meanwhile, back in the body shop, Maeve is having a chat with Felix and Sylvester, where she basically gives this really chilling speech about how she is going to break free from this place, and she is going to use them to do it. And if they don't help her, she will kill them. It's a brief scene. She is really willing to stop at nothing to get out of this place. Meanwhile, Bernard and Teresa are on their way up to Sector 17. While they're in the elevator, they have another exchange where Teresa pretty much says, look, the board is getting rid of Ford. We need the code, and that's why I was stealing it. And she pretty much tries to justify herself for those reasons. So Bernard says that the longer he works there, the more he understands the hosts, and it's the human beings that are actually beginning to confuse him. So they finally get topside in Sector 17, and they see the house. They go in, and it's dark, and there's nobody there. Teresa asks why the house doesn't appear on any of the park surveys, to which Bernard says that most of the park surveys are conducted by hosts, and that the hosts are only programmed to see what they're programmed to see. And none of the hosts are actually programmed to see that house, so they could be staring right at that house and absolutely see nothing. While he's explaining this, Teresa then asks, well, where are these unregistered hosts? And she says this while standing next to, just a big empty wall. And then Bernard says, I guess Ford must have moved them. They're not here right now. And then Teresa says, well, where does this door go? And Bernard says, what door? And that's when we finally 100% get confirmation that Bernard is in fact a host. He has been programmed to not see that door. So they open that door and they go downstairs, and they go downstairs into a basement that is identical to the basement that Bernard has been secretly interviewing Dolores. I use the quotes Bernard here because the sheer fact that Bernard couldn't see that door meant Bernard had no idea that door was there, meaning that Bernard had no idea that basement was there, meaning all of the interviews Bernard has ever conducted with Dolores down there was not Bernard, it was in fact Arnold. Bernard is a host version of Arnold. Bernard reveals that it was a remote diagnostic facility that Arnold and Ford used back during the park's beta days before it was open to the public. Now, inside the glass box that Bernardold had been interviewing Dolores, there is actually a miniature version of the host creation machine. There's a host actively being created inside the white goop. It's also interesting to note that this is also the same basement that was in last week's episode while Ford was interrogating little Robert about why he had murdered the dog. It's also worth noting that during that interview, he was not creating a host. Seeing a host in construction really concerns Teresa. She does not like the idea that Ford is essentially down here and he's able to actually just turn out hosts however he sees fit. And Teresa continues poking around while stumbling across a series of blueprints and finds one that really seems... She sees a Dolores prototype one, but then seems to find one that really seems to surprise her. She calls Bernard over and says, "Bernard, does this mean anything to you?" And she shows him a picture of himself as a host, which Bernard says, "Doesn't look like anything to me." Bernard is indeed a host, and I would further suggest that Bernard is actually a host version of Arnold. Bernard has absolutely, even if he had a reverie system in place, Bernard has absolutely no recollection of ever talking to Dolores inside this glass box, and I'm pretty sure that that host creating machine has been in there for a long enough time that Bernard hasn't been interviewing anyone inside that place. So I think our interviews initially were not actually with Bernard and Dolores, but they were in fact with Arnold and Dolores. Immediately after saying that it looks like nothing to him, you can immediately tell that Teresa puts it together just like that, but it's one moment too late because guess who shows up? Robert Hannibal Lecter Ford. He says that the hosts can't see anything that could potentially hurt them. Anything that could create self-doubt, self-awareness, make them question their reality, cause problems in their head. I mean, look what happened to Peter Abernathy as a result of that photograph and the kind of devastating effects it ended up having on him in the long run, which leads me to believe that that weird distorted right hand side of the image of Ford's father, who is probably Ford's andro father, and then this dead space off to the side that is clearly going to be Arnold. Ford then issues a really chilling line by telling Teresa that the hosts are actually freer than most humans. They're free. They're under his control. Ford reveals that he's been playing Teresa from the start, that he kind of knew she was planning a coup. Teresa keeps accusing him of playing God, to which he actually responds, "I'm only here to tell my stories, and it's you people who wanted to play God with your little undertaking." So Ford clearly knows about whatever kind of project they have going on, and he clearly apparently doesn't feel too tremendously threatened or he would have ended it. He also then admits to knowing that the board of directors won't get rid of him because he's too valuable. Then Ford, word for word, mimics the same exact line from earlier when he tells Teresa that she was right, that this would require a blood sacrifice, but that it wasn't going to be Bernard's. And then he tells Bernard, you know, it looks like our guest is a little weary, maybe you should help her, and then says, "And in that sleep, what dreams may come. Well, there is a huge theme going on. If we go back to the pilot episode with the original Peter Abernathy, he spouted out line after line of Shakespeare lines. Now, it's important to note here in terms of symbolism that sleep is symbolic of death and dreams is symbolic of consciousness. If I was a gambling man, I would say that would have to do with the fact that he just asked Bernard to kill Teresa while alluding to the fact that Teresa's consciousness was about to be essentially resurrected in the form of a host, specifically the host being built in that little chamber right there. So Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy both have actually said that the host being created in there really isn't a host of anyone specifically per se. It's more about an idea about Ford's overreaching power and his unchecked rule in the park and what that could mean for the future. It's more symbolic than anything. I personally, however, still think that it's probably a Teresa host. But we'll find out either next week or next season, maybe. I also think that given the events with Bernard's time spent in the basement and the events of other episodes, that we could probably confirm at this point that we're dealing with about 3 timelines. 2 more so than 1. Clearly, the segments in which Bernard is with Dolores in that basement is its own timeline. It's easy to establish this for the sheer fact that all of Ford's equipment isn't down there at that time, and it's not like that equipment just kind of comes and goes. Bernard also makes mention of the fact that he's not too familiar with the facility other than knowing that it was a diagnostic chamber from the Beta days. And then, of course, the other really big thing that's easy to gloss over is not only just, Teresa's death in this episode, but her death comes at the hand of a host. Regardless of the fact that it's at the command of Ford, a host kills another human being. There was definitely a lot of information to take in this week. We definitely got some answers to a couple of really big burning questions, and it seems like we're on the path to getting a few more answers before the season wraps up. And that's going to wrap things up for my review of episode 7 of Westworld. So if you enjoyed my video breakdown for the week, please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought or what you'd like to see in next week's episode as we come up on episode 8, as we gear up for the final couple episodes before the finale. And I am Slimy, and I will see you all next week.